Kendall, can you tell me what an invertebrate is?
An invertebrate is an animal without a backbone.
Excellent. There are lots of different kinds of invertebrates that live in the mudflats. A lot of them take advantage of the soft sediments to bury themselves in the mud. Clams live most of their adult lives buried in the sand, whereas worms and shrimps bury themselves for hiding but come on top of the sediments to forage and feed.
What kind of worm is that?
This, if you guys can see it here, is called a tube worm, and it lives on docks and rocks, actually, not in the mudflats.
It looks like that's out of its shell.
This, instead of having the mudflats to protect it, it creates its own tube here out of mucus and sand.
If it lives on the dock, what does it eat?
It uses these feather-like, fan-like feathers here called cirri, and it waves around in the water column and filters out particles. Worms and clams are called filter feeders. And they filter the particles out of the water column, the algae, the plankton that we talked about earlier, as well as detritus, which is that fancy scientific word for dead stuff. How do you think clams eat? How do clams eat? What do they use to eat, to filter feed?
They use these siphons.
Yeah, so we've got some siphons that clams, which they're not being very cooperative here today, our scallop here, but this is a picture of a siphon, and they're basically, it's like basically a big straw, and it's got two of them in there, and one of them brings the water in, and the other one shoots it out. And that's how they filter feed. They bury themselves in the mud, and once again, our clams here are they're very shy today and not very open. So we've got another picture here of their foot, which is how they help bury themselves in the mud. So Kendall, can you tell us what makes a healthy home for these mudflat critters?
Clean and cold water from rivers and rain. Tidal salt water, which brings plankton and detritus flushing through the system.
Excellent. And what might be some threats to their home?
Pollution.
What kinds and why?
Warm water, because fish like salmon will die, and leaky septic systems because they are filled with human poo, and storm water because gas, oil from parking lots, and home lawns, and farm fields, and agricultural waste.
Exactly. And where does all that pollutants eventually end up?
In the estuary.
Exactly. And what kind of animals did we just learn live in our estuaries?
Clams, crabs, and worms.
And do you eat clams and crabs and fish and things like that?
Yes.
Yeah, so if we don't want all those pollutants being eaten by all those animals that we eat, what are some ways that we can help keep the estuary clean?
We can plant trees and bushes that shade the rivers and keep them cool, and that filter through bacteria like cow manure and people poo. My dad just pumped the septic system and said we should pump it every 1 to 5 years.
Excellent. And it's also important to know if we're doing a good job in keeping those pollutants out of our estuaries. So groups like Tillamook Estuaries Partnership and South Sioux Research Reserve, where I work, both do water quality testing that help monitor Oregon's estuaries and the health of them.
Thanks, Katja and Kendall. That's great. Kendall, why don't you go ahead and put those things on the food web,